What's up and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. Today I want to take a bit of a deeper dive into how to make your drums hit harder and sound more interesting. In this case, I'm going to be using the Novation Circuit Rhythm as my instrument for doing that, but the stuff I show you will work in pretty much any DAW or piece of hardware. With that being said, let's get into it. All right, I've got a couple of beats I'm going to walk you through. Both are pretty over the top, and hopefully that helps get the point across a little bit easier. So here's the first one. Let's start off with the samples themselves. You do want to get good samples. And if you want to get good samples for $5, hit up the link in the description to get my sample pack, compatible with the Circuit Rhythm, but also just a collection of WAV files that you can use for anything. First thing I want to get into is distortion. So here's the sample originally. It's a decently punchy sample. Here's the original, because I want it to be fairly short. And then here's it with more distortion. Heavily distorted drums are becoming increasingly common in mainstream electronic music and hip hop, and for good reason. It kind of shocks your ears a bit and wakes them up, and can sound incredibly loud without being that loud. Same thing for the snare. It's already fairly punchy. But that distortion just brings it to life. It's kind of compressing it, and so it brings out that extra tail and chops off that transient, but if done well, it's in a pleasing way. Leading into the hyperpop aesthetic quite a bit. And I've got that heavy sidechain on the bass, so those drums actually punch through. I should also mention there are a few different approaches you can take with high or low, long or drawn out, or short drums. In this case, I've elected to go for a short punchy kick and for a high drawn out snare. I've also heard short, low punchy snares do quite well. It depends on the context, and I'm going to come back to some of that in a little bit. Let's get into the hi-hats next. I've got a super simple hi-hat pattern, but accompanying it is this hi-hat pattern. So, a few things going on here. Basically, the secret to good trap hi-hat rolls is panning them back and forth and pitch bends. Listen carefully to this one. You hear that little pitch drop? I've automated the pitch a little bit. Same with this open hi-hat, like that. And pay attention to how these bounce around in your headphones or in your speakers. So this hi-hat is right up the middle the whole time, and these provide that ear candy. And I could even go out of my way to bring in some other percussion to fill in those gaps. And pan that stuff around too and kind of bury it in the mix. Another thing I could do to raise the energy level is to put some kind of open hi-hat or cymbal in the background and then bury it in the mix with some reverb and then just turn it down quite a bit. Immediately raises the energy level to a new notch, essentially, and gives the illusion of a more complex drum part than you actually have. Once again, this is all stuff to spice up your drums, especially in kind of trap-influenced electronic music. But let's get into something completely different. Here's the drums a little more isolated. This is what I was talking about when I mentioned different approaches to drum tones. This is still fairly short, but it's got a much rounder tone and not really much distortion on it. It's fairly clean. Sounds a little more like a real kick. And then on top of that, this snare with this pretty sharp transient, and it's a bit lower, but it's still fairly short. And I just kind of tuned the snare a bit to just sound right with the kick. Nothing super scientific about it or anything. I just wanted it to sound cohesive and have the two transients, aka the attack of the sound, the part of that sound that really punches. I didn't want those to fight too much and cancel each other out. What I could also do is take a sound with kind of a few parts to it. It's got a few different sections. And I could time it so that it hits right before the kick does, like this. Here it hits ever so slightly early. Very common technique in a lot of progressive house. I can even shorten the sound. Make it a little more dry. It's a totally different effect, but it kind of drives the beat forward and keeps those attacks from fighting each other. You're not going to want to use that all the time, but it can absolutely come in clutch. Up next, let's bring in those hi-hats. Let me get that ARP in there as well. Because in this case, they're balancing each other out. So here are my two hi-hat layers. Got that open hi-hat just following the kick. This is kind of a Justice-inspired beat, in case you couldn't tell. And then I'm switching between 3 different hi-hat samples. Like that. And these layer on top of each other to create a more complex hi-hat pattern. It kind of simulates what a real drummer would play, but it's hyper-real. It's not playable on a real drum kit with just one hi-hat, but it creates that illusion, and it drives the beat forward really well. And kind of sits on top of the mix so everything can groove pretty hard. And to make up for everything being panned one way, I've got the ARP panned the other way. It's almost a bit of percussion in its own right. That's pretty hype as is. So then we bring in that bass, those guitars, and that melody. Lots of side chaining, once again. Let me pan this to the center to show you one other trick I really like to use with hi-hats. So check this out. Probably a bit much. Let me shorten those a bit. Here they bounce around in your ears a bit. Create the illusion of a more complex part. Ultimately, to get drums to hit hard, you not only want to have punchy samples that cut through the mix via sidechain and distortion and compression and bringing out the transient, but you also want to make your drums more interesting, to cause the listener's ears to perk up a bit. And you do that with panning, extra percussion layers, pitch bends, and effects such as reverb and delay. And of course, stuff like extra cymbals can do a lot to raise the energy level of an entire track. So use them as an arrangement tool and use them as a tool just to build hype. If you want to go even deeper down this rabbit hole and learn to make your own drums completely from scratch, you can click or tap up over here. I did a video on that. And if you'd like to go deeper down the rabbit hole of making heavy music on a circuit, you might want to check out this video I did a while back as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.